she's staring at.
This is Star Wars the arcade game for the Atari 2600 video computer system, released in 1983 courtesy of Parker Brothers, and this is of course an adaptation of the Star Wars arcade game released that same year, which used vector graphics to recreate the thrilling Battle of Yavin and the Death Star trench run at the end of Star Wars, back when we just called it Star Wars and not Episode 4 A New Hope. And to even attempt to bring that arcade title over to the Atari VCS, a system that was about as much of an arcade powerhouse in 1983 as the Wii U was an overnight sensation in 2013, well, that takes quite a bit of something, let's just say. And credit where it's due, Parker Brothers pulled it off quite wonderfully with the limited hardware they had to work with, and it's just further evidence that even with ancient technology, talent finds a way to produce some pretty amazing things. A lesson that I feel needs to be relearned in this day and age, but I digress. Now, of course, this is not a perfect port. In fact, I could tell you right off the bat, control of your crosshairs to aim your shots is not particularly impressive. Least impressive, actually. Moving it with the joystick, it's a speedy little thing, but when you're mashing the fire button to shoot things, it slows to a crawl, which makes dogfights somewhat cumbersome. There will also be occasions where the control would lag or be unresponsive for a moment, which proves problematic because you're not only using the stick to aim your shots, but also to slightly steer your X-Wing in order to avoid obstacles and fireballs launched your way. But let's backtrack a bit. Star Wars the arcade game is divided into 3 stages. The first stage has you dogfighting TIE fighters. The second stage has you flying along the Death Star surface, shooting down towers and dodging them as well as the fireballs they launch. And the final stage has you doing the trench run, again avoiding fireballs and obstacles as you keep an eye out for that exhaust port that you have to shoot, and if you miss, well, you just have to do the run again until you eventually hit it or you run out of shields. But if you do hit the port, the Death Star blows up and you restart at the first stage. Now a bit harder because you got a couple TIE Advance roaming around lobbing fireballs your way. There's some more obstacles you have to dodge in future trench runs. And also in this game, the Empire has an unlimited amount of resources to create a bazillion Death Stars. And they all have the same design flaw. You'd figure they'd actually get around to fixing that to prevent further Rebel assaults with future iterations, but I guess not. Anyway, in terms of the gameplay, questionable control aside, it's fairly accurate to the arcade original in terms of the level progression and the general gameplay. Naturally, some concessions had to be made, but on a whole, it's fairly straightforward real shooting fare on the 2600. And quite competently done, all things considered. Even in this reduced form, Star Wars the arcade game is a really fun game to play, and I was pleasantly surprised by how well this turned out in spite of the jank controls. You can choose to start at any of the first 3 waves, which again adds extra ties and trench obstacles for you to deal with. Completing a wave will restore some of your shield energy, and once that's all gone, it's one more hit before you get a game over, so pretty straightforward fare, I think. Star Wars kept it relatively simple in its visual presentation. TIE fighters fly at a distance, so there's no fancy dogfights here. The Death Star is this small ball thing, but when it comes to the surface assault and trench runs, those come across rather nicely given the limited hardware. The scaling for the trench run in particular is somewhat smooth, the towers not so much. The flickering, of course, is something to be expected, but still, this was a pretty ambitious undertaking on the part of Parker Brothers, and it just shows the talent on display in making the most of what was, at the time, very limited and archaic hardware. Because back in the day, developers didn't piss and moan about consoles being limited, they just made the most of what they had, and ended up doing some pretty impressive stuff. And it's something that's been lost to the annals of time with 4K this or ray trace that, or whatever the case may be. Anyways, not much to say about the sound effects. They're your stock Atari sound effects, nothing out of the ordinary. There is a nice rendition of the main Star Wars theme that seems like it was featured in a lot of these Parker Brothers Star Wars games on the 2600, but hey, if it works, it works. Why not use it again, and again, and again, and so on and so forth. Overall, Star Wars the arcade game on the 2600 is not too shabby. Obviously not the best version of the game available, and there's ways to play the arcade original if you prefer something a bit more authentic. But that having been said, this is actually not a bad attempt at turning a vector-based title into something that could work on the old VCS. And while controls are not the greatest, it's still very much a playable and enjoyable port of a well-regarded arcade game that would have satisfied most 2600 players at the time. For what it is, Star Wars the Arcade game is a nice effort. I like this one more than I thought it would.